So allow me to make my presentation by saying that I have been involved in the G20 in various roles and formats since 2008, the year when President George W. Bush called the first summit of heads of state and government of the forum here in Washington, D.C. As you know, the forum itself was created in 1999 by the G7 at the initiative of the US and Canada after a decade of financial crisis that erupted in what could be called the periphery. Its main goal was to prevent contagion effects due to the incorporation of the main emerging economies into a group that, together with the G7, ended up being the G20. A precedent for the expansion of the G7 to emerging economies can be found in 1998, when the G7 became the G8 by incorporating the Russian Federation. It wasn't due to economic reasons. Russia was not an advanced economy at the level of the other G7 members. The decision was driven by geopolitical, strategic, and diplomatic considerations. The aim was to broaden the G7's legitimacy by presenting it as a more representative forum, including both developed economies and a major emerging power. When I talk about the series of financial crises that broke out in the 1990s, I think, for example, of the Mexican crisis, 1994, 1995, and the so-called tequila effect that followed. I also recall the successive crises of Turkey, 1994, 1998, 2001. Also the collapse of the Asian tigers in 1997, which began with the downfall of Thailand's economy and finances, but also dragged down South Korea, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where Suharto's regime fell. I remember South Africa's crisis, which coincided with its independence year. In 1998, the crisis of Russia and Brazil followed, and the cycle closed in 2001 with Argentina. It is clear that the first iteration of the G20 in the late 1990s was a defensive effort by the G7. By acknowledging the rise of emerging economies, the G7 sought to contain the shockwaves from the periphery in an era of global economic and financial interconnection. But it is important to highlight that the G20 also represented an effort by the G7 to expand its geographical representation and accept ideological and economic model differences. So, India and Brazil were added along with communist China. The fear of a massive crisis justified adapting to the new reality and inviting the emerging economies on board. From 1999 to 2008, this forum was operated at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors from its 20 member countries. In 2008, I was living in New York, serving as Argentina's permanent representative to the United Nations. Here is the ambassador of Brazil, Maria Luisa, my friend. We shared that position in New York, and after that, we coincided here in Washington. 2008, I was saying, a new crisis erupted. But unlike the earlier ones, this time it was originated at the very heart of the financial world, Wall Street. The crisis threatened to spread globally, and this led to a pivotal decision. President Bush called for an extraordinary meeting of the heads of state of the 20 member countries in Washington, D.C. From then on, the heads of state continued to meet at least once a year in member capitals. I was part of the Argentine delegation at the 2008 Washington summit. And after that, I kept participating in the G20 in different ways. Later, from civil society and as president of the Embajada Abierta Foundation, I participated in the G20, Think Tank 20, in various processes from Germany to Japan. Between 2020 and 2023, it was said, I served as the Argentine Sherpa in the summits of Saudi Arabia, Italy, Indonesia, and India. Now, historically, the G20 has been divided into two major groups, developed countries and emerging economies, the G7 or G8, and I think we can say the rest of the world. Negotiations between these two blocs form the foundation of the annual final declaration signed by the heads of state. However, considering the ongoing transformation of the international reality, it is worth asking whether this rigid framework of negotiations between two blocs is still sufficient or efficient. In my experience, I've noticed distinct subgroups within each bloc, often with divergent interests. Similarly, affinities sometimes emerge between countries from opposite groups. These affinities can lead to interesting dynamics. For instance, in 2023, during India's presidency, while no formal coalitions were established on the topic between developed and emerging countries, key actors from both blocs collaborated on climate financing. The main negotiators were not the blocs themselves, but certain countries from each side. The US and the European Union on the one side, and India and Brazil on the other. I well remember the many efforts undertaken by the American Sherpa, Dalip Singh, and the European Union leaders, Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen, as well as India's Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, and Brazil's Mauricio Carvalho Lirio. A positive development for the forum is the African Union's inclusion as the 21st permanent member in 2024. However, the African Union's membership will not prevent individual African countries from negotiating bilaterally with nations from other continents, be they emerging or be they G7 members, before the African Union solidifies its group position. And this pattern applies to all regional groupings. This gave rise to the idea of a book that would explore new avenues for consensus within the G20 that go beyond the rigid classification of developed versus emerging economies. Breaking this dichotomy is crucial for achieving global solutions that are more inclusive, more adaptive, more sustainable. And there are different reasons for this. Number one, the rigidity of this division limits negotiations. Two, some countries, like China, combine characteristics of both categories. Three, encouraging countries to group around the specific topics, energy transition, food security, technological regulation, fosters dynamic alliances that reflect shared priorities rather than predefined divisions. Four, negotiating based on specific interests can lead to more concrete agreements. Five, promoting heterogeneous coalitions reinforces the perception of the G20 as a truly global forum. And six, initiatives like this do facilitate the strengthening of bridges between regions, Latin America and Asia, Africa and Oceania, North and South America, etc. Overcoming the division between developed and emerging countries in the G20 is not only desirable, but necessary. Negotiating from common interest instead of rigid blocks allows for better responses to complex global challenges, strengthens multilateralism, and advances more inclusive solutions. We live in a world without indisputable leadership, with a cascade of interests that are more crossed, opposed, overlapping, and dynamic than ever before. There is no single North, and there is no single South. In light of this, we must ask ourselves, what is the role and potential of the Americas as a continent in this geopolitical landscape? Can its countries transform old regional hegemonies and dynamics into a new formula that benefits everyone? What agreements and agendas should be pursued? Undoubtedly, this book represents a collective effort aimed at building those essential bridges in our region. It provides various clues to guide us. In an interesting passage of his book preface, Christian Asinelli defines the Americas as a solution region, referring to its vast reserves of water, natural resources, ecosystem solutions, clean energy matrices, food production, and world-class human capital. From Argentina, Federico Pinedo highlights that this work represents a meeting point between the countries of the North and the South, developed and emerging, G7, BRICS, and independence, addressing all the same subject from different perspectives. From Brazil, Mauricio Carvalho Lirio agrees with Pinedo in advocating for the reform of global governance structures. He reminds us that only 4 African countries participated in the 1945 San Francisco Conference of the UN. Now Africa has 54 countries, and the African Union has become a permanent member in the G20 during the Brazilian presidency. From Canada, I hope Cindy is already streaming us. From Canada, Cindy Termorsuisen and Christopher McLennan emphasize a historical fact. The initiative to create such a forum began in the late 1990s, when economic turmoil shook the Americas. And insightful ministers like Paul Martin from Canada and his American colleague, Larry Summers, recognized that common interest, financial and economic in this case, were at stake for the entire continent. We can think that if Martin and Summers had not understood that this was a structural phenomenon involving the entire American continent and all the continents, the G20 would not have started to move forward. The crisis in Asia and Russia proved them right. Something to stress. Canada applauded Brazil's initiative during its G20 leadership to prioritize social inclusion on the agenda, a condition that should remain a continental priority due to the macro imbalances it is causing in terms of migration. The former Sherpa from the US, Talib Singh, states that, and I quote him, "The great challenge of our time respect no borders," unquote, and cites an old American saying, "Never waste a good crisis." Regarding the current situation in the region, he says that if the US found common interests during the financial crisis of the 1990s and 2008, it can do so again now. From Mexico, the former Sherpa Jennifer Feller, she is with us on the stream, mentions agreements with Argentina regarding financing for middle-income countries and debt, and with Brazil regarding poverty and food insecurity to advance initiatives within the G20. This should be highlighted as an example of emerging articulation among American countries in the forum. The mere fact that the 5 American countries that have been G20 members since its inception agreed to participate in a book titled The Challenge of the American Countries at the G20 confirms the need to explore this still unknown territory. The participation of each Sherpa in this work reflects a political decision that goes beyond the individuals themselves and requires the approval of the highest authorities in each government. Let us not forget that the Sherpas are the personal representatives of the heads of state. So, these are the reasons why this small group of men and women from various G20 countries in the Americas came together to write this book and through it contribute to fostering this important debate. So thank you very much for your attention.